Okay, so I'm logging into our instance that has 22R1. It's kind of a neutral, neutral place to start. All right, so you'll see that if someone has property, there's a property management tab here. When you talk about property management, you're adding some extra layers on that standard Acumatica doesn't have. And what I mean by that is here at the top with the tenant, you'll know that it's not uncommon for us to have branches or companies here, but nested within those branches are also the ability to add properties. So we talk with customers during the discovery process and definitely during their onboarding to understand how they report out on their finances. That helps us determine if we need to create a new branch for each property they have, or if they prefer to have multiple properties nested under one branch. We have the capability to do either. We just need an understanding of how they run their business, because ultimately how they structure their branches and their properties will determine their reporting output. So I mentioned those properties. Let's take a look here at these screens. So this is just a normal general inquiry type screen or form for property. Gives you some high level property information. You can see an example of one that's filled out here. Important things to mention are the type of property. Today we have those split between commercial or residential. That helps from a reporting standpoint. When I show you some reports later on, you have the ability to select choosing reports for all of your commercial properties or your residential properties. Obviously, the status of active versus inactive is important also. Inactive, of course, we want to keep any historical information, so we have a way for them to disable or inactivate properties if they're maybe no longer owned by a specific owner or being managed by that management company. And then you'll see the associated branch name too, and that's where it ties into standard Acumatica here. In some cases, it's a one for one. In other cases, it's not. As you can see, Building 102 Roof is the branch here for 1000 Park. Maxwell Commercial Building here actually has Mall Way, Maxwell Commercial Building, and Plymouth Square. So you can see some examples of customizations there. Let's go in and let me show you creating a new one first, and then we can go into one that's already created so you can see what that looks like too. All right, so this is creating a new property. So for here, the description is going to be your property name. And by default, we'll check this as a property. If this is a commercial property, they used to have a checkbox here, but we actually control that here at the bottom, property type. In this case, there's commercial and there's land. I'm going to pause here in a second and go over to a setting that's driving this. I mentioned earlier that we could also control residential properties as well. What's happening here is there are the standard enable disable features from standard Acumatica. There's one for commercial and there's one for residential. If residential isn't checked, then you won't see residential as a property type here, which is what we're seeing. Give me a second. If you're visual like me, I'll show you where I'm talking. So your enable disable features. Somebody's installing this customization for the first time, they'll want to make sure that property management is selected. Yeah, so towards the bottom here, you'll see property management, and then there's a block for commercial and residential. So if you're adding a customization package for the first time, you want to make sure property management at a minimum is selected, and then either commercial, residential, or both. The description is a required field. Again, I pointed out it. The other is that you'll need to select the property type and commercial type here. Those will be two fields that are going to be required of you. There's some other optional information here that might be helpful to somebody the addresses as they're dealing with invoices later on that could be important for them. If they have multiple tracts of land, it might be important for them to track the lot information. They also have the ability to add in other additional attributes that we don't track at a property level today out of the standard package. So they can add those there too. The next is your property spaces. So the next step is to set up units or spaces. Um, so as we start adding them, you'll see them here. I'm guessing it's graying out the add space here because I haven't selected the commercial type for it to pull in the spaces. Um, Expense pool is another one that does require some testing for us, and we're working to get that up and going. What I mean is, earlier I mentioned the concept of common area maintenance and the ability for the the management company to bill maintenance costs back to the tenants. And they're doing that through this expense pool. So they can set up pools where the expenses for maintenance costs go into, and then from there disperse those expenses out to the tenants. This is a piece that was partially built by the ISV partner before the acquisition, but it hasn't been completed. We're waiting to get what they did build into an environment so we can fully test what's there and what's left. So say that. As we add spaces and leases associated with those spaces, you'll actually see a list of them here. I'll go over to a property that exists here in a minute so you can actually see what those look like. And then there's a property management tab also. This is where you'd go in to put the addresses that appear on the invoices. This is where you would be able to set up the security charges, the charge code that's used for security deposits if that's property. Same with the month-to-month charges. So I don't say this without being too confusing. So there's a few different places you can set this up. Um, you can set up at the security deposit at the property level. Let's say you have Ashley Place as your property, and there's always going to be a standard $10,000 deposit for each space for every time a tenant wants to lease a space. You could set up this deposit charge at the property level with the charge code and that amount so that every time you create a lease for this property, it will automatically charge that security deposit. There may be some cases where you only do the security deposit on a case-by-case basis. Maybe the business hasn't been in business for very long, or maybe they have references that weren't too great. So you want to charge, you can leave this blank and actually charge a security deposit to a specific lease instead. If I'm making sense. Same with the month-to-month charge. Month to month, the concept of month to month is that you have a 5-year lease. You're going through lease negotiations probably about 6 months before your lease expires um, as a tenant, and you're going back and forth between the tenant and the management company trying to agree on a deal. For some reason, if you don't agree on that deal and renew your lease agreement before the last day of the existing lease, there's this concept of going month to month, and it's usually written into your contract, your lease agreement, what that dollar amount might be. In some cases, it's even a percentage, which we don't necessarily account for here, and we would need to. May say that if you don't renew by X date, you go into month to month state, and you're charged 5% or the market rate plus 5% of that market rate cost, or a flat rate of $10,000. That's where you'd set that up here. And then the last tab here is the partnership holding. The partnership holding is to say there are a group of 4 owners that own this property. They all have invested in this property. You can set up each of those partners here and their percentage of ownership so that later on you can create a distribution. Usually that's done annually. Create a distribution to those partners. What that means is there's their standard operating costs, and then anything above that is revenue for them to split. So the end of the year, your calculations are done, then you can create a distribution, which essentially creates an invoice for each of those partners, and it calculates you have 20% ownership, so we're going to create an invoice to pay you 20% of the revenue from this year. So that's property. Again, I'm going to jump over really quick just to show what some of these fields look like completed. I feel like the other one's probably going to be better for us. And definitely, as you're having questions, don't hesitate to jump in and ask too. All right, so this is an example where we've set up a commercial property. We've put in the address here, what their square footage is, year of construction. There's a one space set up here and it's occupied. You can click to drill down and view the leases associated with that space, or you can click here to go into that space itself. And I'll show you how to set up spaces here next. I know we don't have anything for expense pool. We're not using that yet. I mentioned earlier, if there are leases for this property, past, present, future, they'll be listed here. So you can drill down into each of the leases or the associated spaces. Do we have anything else filled out? Here's an example of the contract deposit for the property. I don't think we have any. Yeah, we don't have any there. And you'll find people using this to varying degrees. Some truly use this as a CRM and they're filling out every single field, and others are probably vague on the details here because they've got them in a spreadsheet somewhere or another system, depending on how they operate their business. So I talked about the different layers here. Standard Acumatica has the companies and the branches, and then you may have one or multiple properties under each branch. Within those properties, you'll have spaces or units. Um, just industry terminology. A lot of times, what you'll find is that commercial real estate will refer to them as spaces or suites or um, sometimes units, and then units more commonly used with your residential properties. They all mean the same. It's basically a unit or space within a particular property. Got some examples here of what that looks like. So let's create a new one really quick. Bare minimum as far as the fields that are required here at the unit level. At a minimum, you need to select the property that it's for. And it will populate with an existing or the last unit space. If you're creating a new one, all you have to do is type in what that new one's going to be. This is usually a lettering or numbering system for the unit or space, and sometimes they'll have the name be the same, other times they will be different. Completely up to the management company how they refer to their spaces. Maybe they have common areas or um, just different configurations, basically, of their spaces. The summary tab will give you an idea of the occupancy of that space, if it's vacant or occupied. Also, if it's occupied, you'll see tenant information here and what that tenant's paying, and along with a link to their lease. So for us, if we're creating a new unit, the only thing that's required is that unit or space and the name, along with the start date of that space and the space details. Um, this would be, if, as an example, this is a property developer that's using this space and they're also going to manage the property. They put in what date that space is being made available to lease. This could be any date that makes sense to them. This is basically saying this space is now available, we can lease it. And from there, they can save with this addition or this minimal amount of information, or if there's other information they want to add. Oh, I'm sorry. There's also square footage that you need to add. That makes sense. So there we go. We've got the units, the name, actual square footage, and then the start date. There's other descriptions here that they could add in, such as maybe this is a specific unit type. I know this is common in residential where they have 1 bedroom, 1 baths, or 2 bedroom, 2 baths. They may have other descriptions that they use for the spaces, commercial as well. There is a section here to add specific addresses for spaces. This is not uncommon when you're seeing like strip malls or even malls themselves. You'll want specific addresses for that location, and they can be added here. There's also the concept of splitting a unit or combining a unit. Good example is um, a tenant is coming in and they need more space than what the current configuration of a suite is set up for. So they say, we need 10,000 square feet. This space is 5,000. The space next to it's also 5,000. We're going to knock out a wall between the two. So depending on how the management company wants to maintain their records, they could actually combine 2 units like 105 and 106 here and then reflect a lease for the two of them at the moment. And then later on, when that tenant moves out in 5 years, 10 years, they can split that unit up again. Or if they prefer, when we create the lease here in a moment, you can see they could add multiple spaces if they wanted to keep them separate. One lease covers suite 105 and 106. I can say that if anyone is using this, there is definitely some room for improvement here. We've already received a few things from existing customers where we need to allow them to split up a unit for future leases when the space is currently being occupied. Right now, it doesn't allow for that. As the space is being used, you'll see a list of work orders that are associated with that space. See, you've got a kitchen, a dedicated kitchen space or break room in your suite. The faucet's leaking, or maybe you light out in the refrigerator, who knows, right? Um, you put in a work order with the property management company, and then there's a running list of work orders here that are tied to it. Similarly, if the management company is receiving utility bill for tenants, they can add the readings here from those utility meters so that it can then be later billed back to the tenant. Really quick, let's go to a unit that's already set up. So this one's showing that it's occupied, it's not available, and then there's a current lease. And that would take us into the lease information, which is what we're about to dive into. If there are people named on the lease, specifically those tenant names will show up here, which is helpful if management companies needing to reach out to the specific leaseholder or somebody representing that lease. All right, let's dive that last layer deep in property is going to be the lease. So for every unit or space, you need a lease agreement with the tenants that are occupying that space. I mentioned earlier, we have built the lease module on top of the contracts, the existing contract module in Acumatica. So some terms that you might already be familiar with are your customers, your contract templates, because that was existing functionality we used. So these customers that we're seeing here in this customer column are actually pulled exactly from the customer here in the receivables or in your contract, sorry, not your contract, or in your sales orders here. And then you have your contract templates that are also set up, and those are set up here. I want to show you the lease really quick. So the first thing you're doing when you create a lease is to select the property that you're creating a lease for. From there, you'll select the unit or the space that you're getting ready to lease. So there's 106, we just created that space. The system will reflect a new lease ID here until we save and it assigns that lease ID. From here, we'll select our customers. Again, this is a pick list from our customers there on the navigation. Let's do art cages. And then the last thing that we'll select here is the lease template. So this lease template is coming from the contract templates module. We've got a few that are set up here. The description will pull in whatever is part of that lease template. Other things you'll notice is that if you have a customer that might have multiple leases or working with you in different ways, you'll see their outstanding balance from their receivables or their payables here. We also have it broken out so as we're charging them rent for this specific lease, you can see a balance for just this lease as opposed to their overall balance with you as a customer. All right, as we're setting up a lease, the only other things that are must-haves here is the signing date. This would be the date that the tenant or the customer actually signs their lease agreement with you. And you'll notice you can backdate this if you need to. Um, and then you would need to put in the billing end date. So for this would be ideally your last day of their lease. Let's do a 12-month lease. I mean, a 5-year lease, I should say, 2027. And that right there is the bare minimum for you to actually save a lease record in Acumatica. It's not uncommon that you start drafting the lease agreement and sending it back and forth with the customer, and you would want to take the unit or the space off the market, so to speak, while you're going through those negotiations. So even though we require the signing date right now, you really may not have a signing date when you're needing to create this lease agreement and it's in a draft mode while you're going back and forth in negotiations. So sometimes this signing date's a moving target. If you need to update it, I believe it lets you update it after the fact. So I'm just going to save this lease. You'll notice that it gives us a lease assignment here with the lease ID. This will come from numbering sequences. We have them for your leases, is similar to what you have for options with your customers and your AR, AP, that kind of thing. All right, so I've saved this lease. You'll notice it also pulled in the contact that I have for the tenant. These contacts are actually coming from that customer record that was set up. So let's go through a few of these tabs that are of importance. Probably the ones that you'll find are used most is your contacts, where they could be adding additional contacts to discuss the lease. Obviously, you could have hundreds of employees that are working for the management company or that particular customer that's leasing the space. So you can add additional contacts here so that you can reach out to them or have their contact information at hand. Dates is also one of the next more important tabs, and this is where you're putting it in the dates related to the lease. Again, some cleanup opportunities here. Commencement date usually is your start date of the lease, which again, I'm trying to figure out some of the logic behind why they had these split, but there's a commencement date here, but also a lease start date. Usually those are one and the same in many cases for that first lease. There's also the Imperium activation date, and that's basically saying maybe this lease is already 3-4 years in, when we're moving off of one system onto Acumatica. So this would be during onboarding the date that they were imported into Acumatica. Their billing start date would be the first day that we want to charge a bill or start a bill. Um, there's a checkbox associated with this so that if your start date is different maybe than the lease start date, let's say your lease starts on 12/1, but you actually don't want to bill them until the 15th. You can put in that start date here, and if you wanted to always bill them on the 15th of every month, you can check this box, and that would essentially charge on the 15th, in January, February, so on. So the charges tab probably is the next most common one used too. You'll see there's some charge codes already here with this brand new lease. These are coming from that contract template also. You may always charge rent. You may always charge operating expenses or maybe some other charges that you always charge. You can set those up at the contract template level so that they appear here and you don't have to add them for each new tenant. Albeit your rent charges are likely differing, so I'll show you we can add new charges here. All right, so let's set up commercial rent first. I'll warn you, there's a few steps with this that we want to streamline long term. This is where you'll add your spaces to be charged rent. So we'll click on Add and View, and then click this plus sign so that we can go add the property spaces related to this lease. So in this case, we just have one, it's 106. And then we'll add the charge steps associated with this property space. So again, we'll click on this plus sign and we'll start building out what the schedule looks like. They have it here as charge steps because most of the time what you'll find with commercial is that you'll have it structured to increase over time. It won't be a flat rate for the entire term of the lease, as opposed to residential. It's usually the same charge for the entire term of the lease. So for us, this is 12/01/2022. And let's say we agreed the first year you're going to pay a certain amount and then it increases over time. Units of measure are more commonly going to be the dollar per billing period or the annual amount. We've done some testing around this, and this admittedly doesn't play very well with the contract templates. And we needed a better understanding around those. We also want to build out some additional functionality for how we charge too. We've had some existing customers and even some prospective customers that want the ability to charge quarterly or be able to choose the specific months in a year that someone's billed. So just some things coming. All right, so we add in that amount and then we'll click that new line item to start the next amount. You'll see the one place that I skipped over is, let's see, 1130. Is that percent increase. If you wanted to say within their lease agreement, we're going to start you out at $10,000 and we're going to increase 5% each year. You could type in 5% and the system would do that calculation to build those charges out for you. If you wanted to get really granular, you could set, 12, build this out so it's January 2023 to the end of March and then March to April. You didn't have to do this, a full year's time like I did. What you will find is that in the last few releases, we built a stopgap so that the system won't let you have gaps in your dates. We couldn't jump from 11/30/2023 to February. You also can't provide overlapping dates. Like I can't go in and add 12/25 because it's going to flag an error for me. So I've built out charges to span from the beginning of the lease to the end of the lease. And we're going to go ahead and save this. And I'll click save again. I don't have any additional spaces. So I just built out the charges for the commercial rent. Now I want to go in and click on generate schedule. And what that's going to do is look at these items here for commercial rent. It's going to go ahead and generate that schedule. So now what we should see is under the schedule, I'll see each scheduled charge date and what that amount should look like. And now each month when they're billed, what will happen is we'll have a link to an invoice for that month's bill, and it will take us over to the receivables portion of Acumatica. And then, similarly, I could do the same thing with operating expenses to bill them. And sometimes those may be more ad hoc for the expenses because they'll have some complex calculations. I'll jump over to a lease that's already got some charges on it. There is a ledger tucked away here, an AR ledger. So as you start billing those receivables each month, you not only can you see a list of the invoices here under the receivables, but you'd see a list of each invoice tied specific to this lease here too. All right, so we built out the charges. That's ready to go. You'll notice this lease is still in a draft state, so when the time comes, in our case, it's already passed, you would want to make this lease active so that you can start billing this customer. So these ellipses up here at the top have an activate lease action. We can click on that activate lease. And that's going to ask us, well, what date are you going to activate this contract? Again, this can be backdated if maybe you have somebody that doesn't have the best housekeeping. And what that did is now it changes this lease to an active state. And unless I added some dates already, it's going to populate the Imperium activation date to match that signing date. And then the next lease billing date should be 12/1. So it's saying we haven't billed for December yet. And what you should also see here in charges is now it's going to tell us $10,000 is what that next bill should be for. Now that we have this lease created and we haven't billed yet for December, let me show you how um, your users will go through their charges. There's actually two ways. One probably more common than the other. Going back to this ellipses here at the top, there's an option to run contract billing. Um, this makes sense for someone to use if maybe they're just creating a lease for a specific tenant, like in our case right now, and it's already the 16th of the month. Let's say they've already billed every other tenant for December, but this tenant's moving in today, so they need to be billed that prorated amount from the 16th through the end of the month. You could run contract billing specifically for this lease and this lease only from here. This makes sense again if it's a one-off lease. It's not reasonable to expect a user to go into each and every lease at their properties and run this for one at a time. So the alternative for them, if they're getting ready to do their billing for their tenants, is to come back to the property management section and so we're going to go to the generate monthly lease charges. And you'll see a few different fields here. The first is the billing date. The date, this is when we get ready to actually bill all of our tenants. This is the date that's going to be used on their invoice, their AR invoice. So more often than not, what you'll find happening is the management company wants to give as much notice as they can to the tenant so they can pay early if they want, or definitely pay on time. Um, Not uncommon for them to come in right now around the 15th or 16th of the month and run this billing. And so they may post date this to the first. And so this is what this is going to do is go look for everybody that should be billed for January 1st of 2023. You can choose to run this for residential or commercial. So earlier when we were setting up the property and I said the property type's going to be important. This is one of those places where it's important. It's going to go look for, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Not the property, but the actual leases. This is looking at the contract template. I'm sorry, strike what I said. So in this case, it's going to go grab all of the leases for our that are tied to our commercial contract templates. And then there's two actions here. One is edit and one is update. And I would really love to update this so that they're more intuitive, but I'll explain. The first one is edit. So what this is doing is saying, hey, we want to go review all of the charges before they're actually charged so that we can edit them if we need to. I think that was their intent for edit. So this is like a pre-bill. You're not actually charging the customers. You're going to go run this so that you can see what they would be charged. There's also some additional filters if the user needs them. You could filter out specific contract templates, customer classes, specific leases. Um, we also have this show all button. Again, another cleanup activity for us. This should be showing all of those leases by default. We shouldn't have to click the show all, but no, if you're not seeing all of them, it's probably because you have to check this box. This is everybody that should be charged. This is just a snapshot. What we're going to do is click on process all, and what the system will do is generate a report for us in a new window that should give us a readout of what everyone should be charged. And this is what you'll find the management company doing around mid-month to make sure their charges that everyone will get charged, but then they'll be charged the correct amount. So in our case, because I did not restrict this to a specific property, this is going to give us all of our properties. This first one is 1000 Park, and it shows John Albertson with his lease. Again, there's a link there. If I need to go correct something, I can jump right into his lease to do that. And it's showing for January 1st, he's going to be charged $10,000 for his commercial rent, nothing for operating expenses, and then a summary of everything that should be charged at the property for that month. Same thing here. This is ARC Realty or ARC Commercial here. We've got 2 leases on this property. They'd be charged here. So this is the tenant's total charges, and then a total amount of the billing for that entire property. And it's broken down by charge code. So if this looks good, great, we can move on to the next step. If it doesn't, then we want to jump into each lease and go through that process we just went through to update the billing. So this looks good. We can go ahead and close that. And then our next step would be, we can stay on this screen, but then we would want to switch this over to update. So everything else could stay the same essentially. And then update is what's actually going to go and charge each of these tenants that amount that we saw. Standard Acumatica functionality, it's going to give us a list of the errors with that error message so we can go handle and correct issues, but then it will spit out that report and show us everything that it did successfully charge. So in this case, earlier we saw a few pages with a few different leases. In this case, it's only showing me one because it was only able to successfully charge me this one. And then we would have to go back and figure out what's going on with each of these and correct those errors and go through the same process again. In my case, I can tell you it's because this was dummy data that was put in there originally. So it's not going to process those fields. One other quick thing I want to show you, we talked about earlier, and that's the contract templates. Your contract templates are definitely going to be a foundational piece here for property because that's what's driving a lot of the things you're seeing with the lease by default. It makes it easy for the user because if you've got a certain set of things that are happening for every lease at your property, it's a quick way to add it, as opposed to configuring each lease uniquely or individually when they really have similarities. So we've set up a few here, just as some examples of what we think probably is most common. Having a specific contract template that's unique to residential lessees and then commercial. So I'll go in and show you what this commercial one looks like. I don't know if you guys have used contracts in Acumatica already. Some of this may be familiar to you. If we were creating this from scratch, we would need to give this template a name and a description. By checking this Imperium contract template box, this lets us know that this contract template needs to be presented to us when we're creating a lease. If this box wasn't checked, we wouldn't see this as an option to select when we're creating that new lease. So that piece is important. You also have the number of days, which Um, in our case, for leases, doesn't really matter because we're driving the lease by the dates that are in the lease itself, that date tab we looked at earlier. They do have some fields here that we use: the renewal point, the Imperium renewal point, the grace period. Again, some opportunities for us to hide this renewal point um, because we're using this one. What this means is that an existing lease can't be triggered to renew until it's at least 90 days or less before it's getting ready to expire. So, as an example, the one that I just created goes through the end of November of 2027. So, um, I realistically wouldn't be able to renew that lease until August of 2027 in this case. Um, and that logic's going to be driven from this field as opposed to this one. Um, we've done some testing, still need to do some more testing around this grace period. I don't believe that this is actually affecting our leases at the moment. Um, ideally, we do need to put things in place where someone could renew um, their lease, and we don't necessarily want this grace period driving that. So um, that is what it is. The billing settings, those are similar to, again, standard contract. Tells us the billing period. We've done some testing around this billing period and how it relates to the charges in a lease. So when you're creating your charge steps, this is where you're selecting if you're charging by the billing period or the per month, per year. One of the other things to make mention is the invoice description and the line description. So when I go to charge rent as an example on a lease, this is the description format that you'll see at the invoice level, and this can be configured however they'd like. And then for the line, each individual line item, this is what you'd see. Like the line item for rent, this is the format that you would see. Some customers want this to read a specific way so they could come in and alter that. One of the other things that's here is the details. I mentioned earlier when we were setting up this lease that the line for commercial rent and operating expenses were already here. That's because we set them up here at the contract template level without a price so that the line would be there and we could determine the price. It's also where we said whether or not late charges could be applied to that particular charge. So if I don't pay the rent on time, you could apply late charges to the rent. In some cases, you could apply late charges to the operating expense, you name it. This is also where you can set up and configure those late charges for a specific lease type. Um, again, each management company is a little bit different. You may have a standard late charge that spans your entire property, um, or you could have one that's unique to each lease. If it spans the entire property, it definitely makes sense to set up the late charge calculations here. If it doesn't, then you could set them up at the lease level. If there's ever a question as to what templates are being used, the contracts here will list out every lease agreement that's using this particular contract template here. There's SLA terms that we don't really use for the lease, like you would a normal contract. They are also attributes here that you could add. We don't use these too terribly much, though.